The Great Hall of the African Union Summit was silent. But it wasn't the soft, peaceful silence of agreement, it was the heavy, waiting silence that comes when something serious is about to happen. Behind the long rows of desks sat some of the most powerful leaders on the continent. Their national flags stood proudly behind them. Cameras from every corner of the hall broadcast the scene live to millions of homes. The official agenda promised discussions on trade progress and unity. Yet deep down, everyone knew why the air felt charged. There was a question hanging over the room, one that no one seemed ready to answer. In Kenya, young protesters had marched with nothing but their voices. They carried no weapons, threw no stones. They came to demand a better future, jobs, dignity, change. But instead of hearing answers, they heard gunfire. Many fell, their blood staining the streets. And in the days that followed the African Union, the body sworn to represent all Africans said nothing. No condemnation, no investigation. Silence. For many watching, it felt like betrayal. Wasn't the AU meant to be the guardian of democracy, not its silent witness around the continent? Young people ask the same painful question. If our leaders will not speak for us when we are killed, who will? That question was about to be answered, and the answer would come not from the oldest, most experienced voice in the room, but from one of the youngest, a 36-year-old soldier turned president who had never learned how to be afraid of telling the truth. What happened next would break one of the oldest unwritten rules of African politics and ignite a spark that could not be put out. Please stay with me. Because once you hear what was said in that hall, you may agree this was the moment African leadership changed forever. And you might just find yourself asking, if it were my country, would I have the courage to speak? The name President IBRAHIM Traoré was called. From his seat, the young leader of Burkina Faso rose slowly. The green and gold trim of his military uniform caught the light as he straightened his shoulders. He was not just walking to a podium, he was walking into history. The room followed his every step. Some leaders adjusted their earpieces. Others leaned back, arms crossed, curious to see if the youngest head of state in Africa would speak like the elders with polished caution, or like the soldier he once was, blunt, direct, and unafraid. When he reached the microphone, he didn't rush. His eyes swept across the room, locking momentarily with each leader. Then, with a steady voice, he began, "I come here today not just as the president of Burkina Faso, but as a young African. Like millions across our continent, I am tired. Tired of our leaders ignoring the cries of the people." A low murmur rippled through the hall. Some leaders shifted in their seats. Others looked down at their notes. Traore pressed on. In Kenya, young people marched peacefully. They attacked no one. They only wanted answers. Instead, they were met with bullets. Murdered. And what did we, the African Union, say? Nothing. The air tightened. Traore's tone was calm, but the weight behind his words was unmistakable. We say we love democracy. But what kind of democracy kills the youth for asking questions? If we say nothing, we become part of the crime. Cameras zoomed in on faces in the audience. A few leaders' expressions hardened. Some avoided eye contact altogether, but Traore did not slow. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I am calling for a full, open, and international investigation into the violence in Kenya. We must know who gave the order to shoot. We must know who pulled the trigger. We must know why African youth are treated like enemies in their own countries. And if any president is behind this, whether it is President Ruto or anyone else, he must be held responsible." It was a sentence few had ever dared to speak aloud inside an AU summit. In the past, such matters were handled quietly in back rooms away from cameras. But here, under the bright lights and live broadcasts, the unwritten code was being shattered in real time. The silence in the room was now electric. Traore let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing, "We are not here to protect each other. We are here to protect our people." For a brief second, it felt as if the hall itself took a breath. This was no diplomatic performance. This was a challenge to every man and woman in that room to choose between loyalty to a fellow leader and loyalty to the citizens they claimed to serve. On social media, the reaction was immediate. Clips of his speech were already circulating on phones and news feeds, even before he finished speaking. Back in the hall, Traore closed his remarks with deliberate simplicity. "We cannot remain silent when the blood of our youth is still fresh on the streets. The future of Africa depends on whether we stand for justice or hide from it." He stepped back from the podium, scanned the room one last time, and returned to his seat. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't just the silence of caution, it was the silence of shock. Some leaders whispered quietly to their aides. Others simply stared ahead, hands folded, unsure how to respond. For the millions watching, especially young Africans, the message was clear. Someone had finally said what needed to be said. Someone had looked power in the eye and refused to blink. Little did they know another voice, older, seasoned, and equally unafraid, was about to stand and make this moment even bigger. The moderator shuffled his notes, clearly preparing to move the session along, when an unexpected movement caught the room's attention. From across the hall, President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa slowly rose to his feet. It wasn't his turn to speak. He wasn't on the schedule, yet in that instant, the authority he carried was unmistakable. He adjusted his jacket, stepped into the aisle, and walked towards the podium. The room stirred. A few leaders whispered to their aides. Others leaned forward, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Ramaphosa was one of the most influential voices in Africa, respected, cautious, and rarely impulsive in public settings. The fact that he was taking the floor without prior notice was already breaking protocol. He reached the microphone, looked around the hall, and began in a deep, measured tone. "I was not scheduled to speak. But after what I have just heard from President Traore, I must." The atmosphere shifted instantly. This was no longer an isolated statement from a young leader. This was about to become a conversation, and possibly a confrontation among Africa's most powerful figures. Ramaphosa's eyes moved deliberately from one end of the hall to the other. "I want to thank President Traore for his courage. He spoke truthfully, he spoke with heart, and he spoke for millions of young Africans who are watching us right now." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. What happened in Kenya cannot be ignored. Young people died, people who had no weapons, people whose only weapon was their voice. That is not democracy. That is a tragedy. Some leaders shifted uncomfortably, others kept their gaze fixed on the papers in front of them. Ramaphosa didn't raise his voice, but his words carried the quiet force of conviction. We cannot be leaders who look the other way when injustice happens. If our people bleed in the streets and we stay silent, then we are not leaders, we are cowards. There it was, a line that seemed to cut through decades of polite but empty speeches. Then came the moment that made even seasoned diplomats lean forward. Let me be clear, South Africa supports the call for an independent investigation into what happened in Kenya. And if there is evidence that state power was used to silence peaceful voices, then those responsible must be held accountable, no matter who they are. Gasps were audible in the hall. This was South Africa, a continental heavyweight, openly backing Traore's demand and placing pressure directly on President William Ruto of Kenya. Ramaphosa turned slightly towards the Kenyan delegation. His voice remained calm, but the precision of his words left no room for misinterpretation. "President Ruto, if you believe your hands are clean, then you should welcome the investigation. The people deserve to know the truth. It wasn't an insult. It was a challenge, public, firm, and in front of the entire continent." He turned back to address the whole assembly. "The African Union cannot continue to act as a club of silence. We must be a voice for our people, not just for each other. If we are afraid of the truth, then we don't deserve the seats we sit on." And then, with deliberate clarity, "The youth of Africa are watching. And I want them to know we hear you, we see you, and we will not be silent." When he stepped away from the podium, the hall was frozen. A few leaders clapped softly. Most sat in stunned silence. Outside the walls of the AU summit, the reaction was immediate. On social media, hashtags like Traore and Ramaphosa, justice for Kenyan youth, and AU reform now began trending within minutes. Clips of the two speeches flooded Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok, each one drawing tens of thousands of shares. In South Africa, young activists who had long criticized Ramaphosa for being too cautious now praised his decisiveness. In Burkina Faso, Traore's supporters celebrated the fact that their leader's words had found an ally in one of Africa's political giants. And in Kenya, though the streets were still tense and quiet, the online space erupted with emotion, relief, gratitude, and renewed determination. Back in the AU hall, the sense of disruption was palpable. The old rules, the ones that dictated that presidents protect each other at all costs, had just been broken twice in the same morning. And for the first time in years, the African Union had become the stage for a raw, unscripted demand for accountability. It was no longer just about what happened in Kenya. It was about the future of African leadership and whether silence in the face of injustice was finally becoming unacceptable. Inside the African Union Hall, the air felt heavier than before. Two speeches had changed the rhythm of the summit. Normally, such gatherings followed a predictable script: ceremonial greetings, cautious language, and vague commitments that pleased everyone but solved little. This time, the script had been torn apart in front of the cameras. At the high table, members of the AU Commission exchanged glances. There was no prepared statement for a moment like this. One senior official leaned toward another and whispered urgently. A pen scratched across a notepad as someone jotted down phrases that might work in a response, phrases that sounded careful, neutral, and above all, non-committal. But everyone in that room knew the old language suddenly felt inadequate. The ripple effect started almost immediately among the regional blocs. The West African delegation turned to their representative from Senegal, who shook his head slightly, signaling hesitation. In the Central African group, the mood was frozen. No one wanted to speak too soon. Over in the East African corner, the Kenyan delegation sat stiff, their expressions unreadable. President William Ruto himself leaned forward, slightly, elbows on the table, face impassive. His eyes never strayed from the center of the room, but his mind was clearly running calculations. He had just been publicly challenged twice by fellow heads of state on a live broadcast. Around the room, some leaders began privately weighing their options. The president of Namibia quietly asked his advisor, "Do we support the investigation?" The advisor hesitated, then replied, "We may have to." Silence might be worse. The president of Ghana tapped a pen on the table, lost in thought. He admired Ramaphosa's authority and Traore's courage, but the political reality was sharp today. It was Kenya. Tomorrow, it could be any of them. In the back, journalists were already firing off updates. The news cycle had shifted. What was supposed to be a summit about economic cooperation was now dominated by the story of two presidents calling for accountability. And it wasn't just in Africa. International correspondents watching the feed were drafting headlines for audiences in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. During the break, the normally convivial lounge, a place for coffee handshakes and polite chatter, had a different atmosphere. Leaders gathered in small clusters, speaking in low tones. Some conversations were sharp. Did you expect Ramaphosa to go that far? No. But if South Africa is backing this, we can't just pretend it didn't happen. Traore? How does a 36-year-old shake this place like that? A few tried to defend Ruto. We don't know the full facts. We shouldn't rush to judge. But others countered quickly. Then let's investigate and find the facts. That's exactly what they're asking for. By the afternoon, the conversation in the plenary session had shifted. Delegates proposed drafting a motion carefully worded without naming Kenya directly to consider forming a special AU fact-finding committee on state violence and protest rights. Everyone knew what it was really about, but the language was crafted to avoid further open confrontation. Outside the summit, the reaction was far less cautious. In Nairobi, activists who had been silenced by fear now shared the clips of Traore and Ramaphosa on their phones, whispering to each other in cafes and university courtyards. They said it. They actually said it. In Johannesburg, students gathered in public squares holding signs that quoted Ramaphosa's line, "If our people bleed and we stay silent, we are not leaders, we are cowards." In Ouagadougou, murals of Traore in his green beret appeared overnight, painted alongside the words, "We speak for Africa's youth." For civil society organizations, this was a turning point. Human rights groups began drafting letters to the AU demanding swift action. Legal associations in several countries started circulating petitions calling for an international inquiry into the Kenya killings. On Twitter and Facebook, hashtags kept climbing in visibility, merging into a continental conversation about leadership, justice, and the meaning of democracy in Africa. Inside the AU, however, not everyone was ready for this wave. Some leaders quietly hoped the uproar would fade with time. Others feared the precedent: if one president could be publicly challenged, then none were untouchable. But in the eyes of the public, a barrier had been broken. The old club of silence had been breached, and once the walls of silence crack, it's hard to rebuild them. That evening, as the sun set over Addis Ababa, many of the leaders weren't thinking about the official resolutions or trade agreements. They were thinking about the speeches they had just heard and wondering how they would respond if one day their own citizens filled the streets demanding change while the rest of Africa watched. Because now everyone knew silence would no longer be the safe choice. From an American perspective, especially for those who remember the civil rights movement, what happened inside the African Union Hall felt strikingly familiar. The image of a young leader standing alone at a podium speaking truth to power echoed the moral courage of figures like Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, or Barbara Jordan. It wasn't about the size of the country he led. It was about the weight of the truth he carried. For older Americans, many of whom had witnessed the televised brutality against peaceful protesters in Selma or Birmingham, the footage from Addis Ababa stirred something deep. The details were different. Kenya was thousands of miles away, its streets and politics unfamiliar, but the principle was the same: unarmed citizens demanding dignity and power, responding with violence. Diplomatically, the speeches of Traore and Ramaphosa sent ripples far beyond Africa's borders. In Washington, policy analysts and State Department officials would have noted the significance of South Africa's public endorsement of an investigation. South Africa is a strategic partner for the United States in areas like trade, counterterrorism, and regional stability. Its alignment with a younger, more defiant voice like Traore's could signal a shift toward a bolder, more united African political stance. In Europe, especially within the EU and the UK, observers would see the event as a test of Africa's political maturity, whether the AU could hold one of its own accountable without collapsing into internal division. For global human rights organizations, the moment was a gift, a high-profile case to rally around, backed by two leaders with very different political profiles, but a shared message of accountability. China and Russia, watching from their own vantage points, might view the incident less as a moral turning point and more as a strategic opportunity. Both have been courting African nations with promises of investment free from Western political conditions. The openness, even defiance, on display at the AU summit could strengthen their narrative that Africa is breaking away from old alliances and expectations. Yet beyond the geopolitics, there's a universal truth that resonates everywhere: leadership is tested, not when it is easy to speak, but when silence would be safer. For many Americans, particularly those over 60 who have seen how the arc of history bends only when someone dares to push the question, is timeless. Would we speak out if we were in that room? Would we welcome the investigation if the accusations were against us? And perhaps in living rooms across the United States, people nodded quietly, knowing that the courage shown in that African hall was the same kind of courage that had once changed their own nation. When the summit's cameras finally stopped rolling, the speeches of President IBRAHIM Traoré and President Cyril Ramaphosa were already being replayed, dissected, and shared across Africa and beyond. What they had done was rare, not simply because they challenged another head of state, but because they challenged an entire culture of silence. This was more than Kenya. It was a warning to every leader: the youth of Africa are watching and the world is listening. The old shield of mutual protection, the unspoken pact to never call out a sitting president in public, had been cracked. Once broken, it cannot be mended easily, but history teaches us that moments like this can fade if they are not followed by action. Investigations can stall, statements can be buried under bureaucracy, and public outrage can be redirected or silenced. The danger now is not just that the truth may be hidden, it is that this moment of unity and courage could be lost to political fatigue. For those of us watching from afar, there's a lesson here. Leadership isn't just about governing a nation. It's about defending the dignity of its people, even when it means standing alone. And if you believe that, then you know why this moment matters far beyond the walls of the AU. So I'll leave you with this. If you were in that hall, would you have stood up or would you have stayed silent? Please share this if you believe leaders must answer to their people, not just to each other. Subscribe if you believe the truth should never be silenced, because the day we stop demanding it, we lose the right to expect it.